Hi all, welcome to a new video lecture on a subtopic of module 1 of database management system course, that is database languages. Okay, so we can think about different languages theoretically, but practically we have something called an SQL language which satisfies everything. Okay, so which is a superset of all this. Okay, anyway, we will see it in a theoretical way first. So the first one is something called a data definition language. So as the name says, it is something that can define the data or it can define the structure. Okay, so once you define the structure and you populate it with the data, you can manipulate it, right, by adding a new data, by modifying it, or by deleting a data. So that is what is done by data manipulation language. So this is a broad classification of languages in database management system. Languages that are dealing with the database, data definition language and data manipulation language. Okay, so data definition language is used by the database administrator and by the database designers who are designing the database, means who are designing the structure, right, to define both conceptual and internal schema. So at this point you have to understand that we are using DDL for defining conceptual and internal schema. Internal schema is actual physical representation, storage related things. Internal schema is dealing with the access path, those things, and conceptual schema is the definition and the design of the actual database, that is the database itself, right, the actual data. So we can use it for defining both. So in DBMS, where no strict separation of levels are there, why it is highlighted is sometimes there are two, in addition to data definition language, we have something called storage definition language also. Sometimes this DDL will do this STL job also, or if you want you can separate the DDL duty and a subset of it, that is DDL here, it is saying that the DDL is taking care of both internal schema and conceptual schema, right. So that is one way. The conceptual schema and internal schema both are taken care by the DDL itself. Okay, now another way is you can separate it. Just let the data definition language deal with the conceptual schema. Okay, and for internal schema we can use a different language because it is more close to the actual physical implementation, right. So we can use something called a storage definition language, using which you can define internal schema. Okay, so there are two ways. One thing, the conceptual schema you define using data definition language, and internal schema you can define using storage definition language. So from the name itself it's clear it's dealing with the storage, or the DDL itself we can use for both. Okay, so both alternatives. So mostly that is this first point is what you can see in practical cases. Okay, so say all of them will be implemented by some common language. So that is, but if you want theoretically you can separate also. And there is something called a data definition language compiler. If there is SDL also, then SDL compiler also will be there, whose function is to process the data definition language DDL statements in order to identify the description of the schema constructs and to store the schema description in the DBMS catalog. So whenever we are defining the structure, the conceptual schema, that you typically mention using a high level programming language. That is a practice we are having. So those, maybe in the next semester you will be doing mini project and all using this front end and back end, and that time you may be using this, just say this Java or something as your front end development. Front end means the one which the user is interacting with, and for the back end development, for the which is dealing with the actual storage of information and all, we will be using some database language. Okay, so it may be DDL or DML. Typically we need both DDL and DML. So we have a practical, so this is the general theoretical understanding. So practically this DDL, DML, those things are done by something called a structured query language, SQL language, and its variation like MySQL, Oracle, many things are there. So some of them which you are comfortable you will be using for the backend design, and that time you will see, like in your high level language, something like Java, a programming language, you will embed the queries what you want from the database, that you will mention using Java, and that time this DDL compiler, it will analyze your high level the particular application program, and it will interpret only that core statements which are dealing with the actual database, okay, or the data definition language related queries will be separated from the application program using this DDL compiler. So that is the role of DDL compiler, whose function is to process only the DDL statements in order to identify the description of the schema construct and to store. So sometimes you want to store the schema, sometimes you want to access it, right? So both will be done by so actually DDL compiler is something that separates the application program from the DDL queries. So typically the database related to some queries also, so we use a term query actually database related statements, let me call like that, in the high level language we will embed inside our Java program or something application level program. That time this compiler will separate it and it will execute them with the database, okay. In database management system, where a clear separation is maintained between conceptual and internal levels, so these levels, you know, conceptual, internal and view, right? So if there is a clear separation between them, the DDL is used to specify conceptual schema only. So this is one way. If both concept schema are and physical schema are completely separate, then you can use DDL for defining the concept schema. And another language called storage definition language can be used for internal schema. The mappings between these two can be specified in either of these language. Either DDL will do the mapping from DDL to STL commands, or SDL can do the mapping from DDL to SDL also. So whatever it is, so that we can do. And in that case, so right now when you are looking at the three schema architecture that we discussed in the last part, the previous video, we saw that there are three schemas, right? For internal schema, conceptual schema and view external schema. For defining internal schema, we have a storage definition language, and for conceptual schema we have a DDL, data definition language. Now what about external schema? For external schema also we can think of a language, say the view definition language. External schema is dealing with the views, right? So we can think about something called view definition language to specify the user views and their mappings to the conceptual schema. But in most of the DBMS, the last line is important, DDL is used to define both the conceptual and external schema. Okay, the same DDL. So the conclusion is same DDL can be used for defining the conceptual schema, external schema, and of course the internal schema. All those things can be defined by it. Okay, that about data definition language. Okay, so same thing you can use for defining conceptual, internal and external schema, or you can use separately. Okay. And another one is called, so now the structure definition is over, and of course the data is populated also, and now we want to manipulate the data, right? So for that we can use something called a data manipulation language, by which you can insert a new record, or you can delete something, or you can update the already presented data, or you can select some subset of information. Those things are done by data manipulation language. Anyway, we will show this queries and all in detail, and that time you will get a very clear picture of it. So for the time being, we are going as per the syllabus, so that is why you may be having some doubts in your mind. After completing the course, everything will be cleared, okay. So gradually we will develop concept one by one, okay. So once the database schemas are compiled and the database is populated with the data, users must have some means to manipulate the database. So data structure is defined, right, and the schema is defined, then we populate it also. Now we are going to manipulate. The typical manipulation include the retrieval of some information what the user is interested, insertion of some new information, deletion of something that is not needed, as well as the update or the modification of the data. The DBMS provide a set of operations or a language called a data manipulation language for doing this. Now there is so this DDL and DML is something generally we mentioned, or in a theoretical way we can say we need this kind of languages for dealing with the database. Now practically there is something called a structured query language. SQL is a very popular one, and we will see this separate module itself is there for dealing with the SQL queries and all, okay. And there are many variations of this structured query language. Different vendors are come up with the different so SQL is something that is a starting point. The very first implementation, and it gone through different versions, variations, and there is something other open source implementations, MySQL, Oracle, many things are there, okay, many variations, okay. So it's a software actually for which is used to deal with the database. So it will do this data definition as well as data manipulation, both you can do using this SQL. So in the current database management system, the preceding types of languages are usually not considered distinct. So we can think of them as distinct, like a view definition language, storage definition language, data definition language, data manipulation language. But actually, in practical case, when you are going to see, there is some common language which can do all of them. Okay, rather a comprehensive integrated language is used that includes considered for conceptual schema, definition, view definition, and manipulation, everything. Okay, and of course if you want you can use the same for internal schema definition also. That is something missing, but sometimes it will be separated also. A typical example of such a comprehensive language which can do manipulation, definition of conceptual, view, schema, everything, is called a SQL, particularly SQL relational database language. So there is relational and non-relational databases are there. So typically most of the traditional applications are working on SQL relational database language. Anyway, what is this relation? So it's a mathematical concept, we will see those things. Okay, and variations are also there, so that is why it is highlighted, which represents a combination of DDL, VDL, view definition language, data manipulation language, as well as it can do many more things like statements for constraint specification, schema evaluation, and other features are also there for this SQL. So it's a complete thing. It can do all these things together. So, but theoretically, you can think about different languages for doing different things. Okay. And now one more small topic. So why I am highlighting this terminology, sometimes they ask questions like that. So by looking at the question paper, I was explaining these things like what is procedural and non-procedural DML, like that. Small concepts only. Yeah. One second. Yes, the non-procedural and procedural data manipulation language. Okay, so there are two main types of DML, procedural and non-procedural. So what is procedural? So let me just tell you what they mean by these things. So as a name says, procedural DML means low level, that procedure is to be mentioned in detail, something like that. Okay, so if you want to access some subset of information, retrieve some subset of information, and you want to check, for example, let me tell you. So you are maintaining a student database where you have information of all students, right? And you want to know the set of all students who secured CGPA say greater than 8. Okay, so 8 and above. You for some, maybe for a scholarship or something, you are interested with that. Okay, the faculty is interested, or staff advisor is interested to know. So what we can do is we can write a program, and it will what it will do, there will be records of thousands of students say in the database, and it will take each record one by one in a very detailed way, and it will verify that CGPA column, that particular cell alone, and that particular information alone. For record means the complete information about a single student. Okay, record or instance we can say, and the database is actually collection of these instances. Okay, and for each instance we have name, roll number, many things are there, and we will particularly look at that CGPA, and if it is greater than or equal to 8, we will output it. Again the second one will be checked, and we will output. So like that, it involves the processing of record one after another. So we can call it as record at a time DML also. So that is the way it is working. But if there is some other way by which the whole thing, so at any time it can process over one record at a time. So that is a limitation it is having. So it must be, so typically it is, so for doing that, we need the support of looping structures and all. So then only using some loop index variable, we will iterate among all the records. One by one you will take and you will process. Okay, that is the way typical procedural DML is working. Okay, so a low level or the procedural DML must be embedded in a general purpose. So they don't have an independent existence. So definitely you should embed them in a general purpose programming language. So this type of DML typically retrieves individual records or objects from the database and process each one separately. Therefore it needs to use programming language constructs such as looping, because you want to iterate among the database, right, one after another. Okay, so such constructs you must use. So without a programming language help, they can't exist independently to retrieve and process each record from a set of records. So low level DMLs are also called a record at a time DML because of this property. Now we have a slightly improved variation of it, so definitely we can think of it as a high level DML. Okay, so which is called there is no detailed procedural manner we are applying, so we can call it as a non-procedural DML or high level DML. So SQL, as we already seen on the previous slide, is an example for that. So practically we need this, right? We don't want to spend that much time. So we could be able to select a subset of information together, right? So which are keeping that criteria. So there should be some way of retrieving them. So that is secondary thing. So that is something. They are making use of the access path, like indexing structures for achieving this. So how it is achieved is a different story, but we are just seeing the difference. Okay, so that time this SQL can be thought of as a high level non-procedural data manipulation language that can specify and retrieve many records in a single DML statement. So with a single query, many records you can retrieve. Right, so you don't have to write a loop for that. You just ask what is needed. So those who satisfy that criteria will be retrieved all together as a set. Okay, so previously it was record at a time. At any time only a single record will be coming from the database, but here at any time a set of records will be coming. So we can call it as a set at a time DML or set oriented DML. How those set of records are coming, so that is a different thing. Okay, so that is something about the implementation details. So mostly the SQL currently we are having this, not mostly the SQL what we are having now is following this one. So definitely this is what is time saving, right? So many DBMS allow high level DML statements, so as it is independent, right? So you can mention what is needed, so those things are together coming from the database. So that kind of a structure it is. It can exist independent of the embedded. I mean there is no need of a programming language to which you can embed it, but if you want you can embed inside a programming language also. So they have independent existence also. So these statements either to be entered interactively from a display monitor in a direct way or terminal, or it can be embedded in a general purpose programming language. So in the later case, so when you are embedding in a general purpose programming language, DML statement must be identified within the program so that they can be extracted by a pre-compiler and processed by DBMS. So the high level, I mean general purpose programming language, if you are embedding just like in the previous case, from the programming language construct, you have to separate the database related queries, right? So they have to be separated by a DDL compiler kind of thing, something extra you have to execute, and that will separate and they will execute it in align with the database management system software. Now a query, so now we have a terminology called a query. So definitely this kind of accessing, I use this terminology before also, but formally speaking, what is a query? In a high level language, DML often specifies which data to retrieve rather than how to retrieve it. Therefore such languages are also called so this is not the definition of a query. So here somewhere, yeah, query is something when you are querying something, you want to retrieve some information. So what you are writing as a command to retrieve the information is what you can call as a query. Okay, so that about it. So if you are looking at a high level data manipulation language, a typical query, if you are looking, often they specifies data to retrieve rather than how to retrieve the data. Okay, so they are also called as declarative. So programming language also we have this kind of a classification: imperative and declarative programming language. Declarative programming languages are typically non-procedural in nature, but we are actually familiar with the imperative category, which is procedural language. Whether you are looking at C programming, Java, they are all procedural in nature. So that means we have to tell what is needed, right? What is needed and how to get it, right? Everything you have to mention in detail. In the way you are already familiar with the C programming and all, how you are writing the program. So each and everything you have to mention, right? So you have to declare a variable, you have to initialize the variable, then you have to give a statement, enter the value, then user will be entering the data that is to be read and it is to be stored in the variable, like assignment. So everything you are mentioning like a procedure, right? In detailed procedure you are giving, and the compiler will be taking it and it is executing it for you. So that is procedural kind of thing. So we are mostly familiar with the procedural thing, but SQL is a non-procedural thing in the sense something is happening in the background. So with that we are getting the information in a very quick way, like in as a set of information we are getting it. But background what is happening is some kind of procedural thing only, but that is something hidden from the user. So from the user point of view, what I am in need, I am just mentioning as a single query and I am getting it. Okay, so that is the way. So you can call it as a declarative data manipulation language also. So just like the declarative programming language like Prolog or Lisp, those things are declarative in nature. Okay, so here also you can think about it. So the compiler will be taking care of the difficulties. Okay, so from the user point of view, what the user is needed, he will be asking, he will be getting the response. But the compiler is doing many things for you. So that about it. But when it comes to procedural, you will mention everything, how to take the data, everything you will mention in detail, maybe using looping structures and all. So it is from the compiler point of view, it has to execute something minimum. Okay, so that about it. Anyway, I hope you get a overview. You should be able to differentiate these two things. They can ask such a question. Okay, it was there in the previous question papers and all. Now few more things. Query language interfaces. Okay, so let's see. So when a data manipulation language commands, so whenever DML commands, whether high level or low level, are embedded in a general purpose program. So we already seen that low level DML you must have to embed in a general purpose program language. High level you can either embed or you can work them independently also. So in that case, if you are embedding, the language is called a host language. For example, if you are embedding some SQL commands in Java, you can call it as a host because it is hosting. And the DML part, the actual the one which is dealing with the database is what we can call is data sub language. Okay, so that is just a terminology. The application, the high level language program or general purpose programming language on which you are embedding the DML commands, the language you can call as a host language, and the DML commands and all you can call as a data sub language. On other hand, sometimes this will high level, not low level, the high level data manipulation language that sits independent, right? That time if it is sitting in a standalone manner, in a standalone interactive manner, where it is trying to interact directly with the database, not through a language, it is what we can call as a query language. Okay, so the query language, that terminology is purely the second category which is existing in a standalone manner. Yeah, if it is embedded inside, we can call it as a data sub language, and the one who is embedding it is what we call as a host language. Okay, just three terminologies. Now if you are looking at the casual end users, they typically use a high level query language to specify their request, whereas the programmers use the DML in its embedded program. So for the programmer who are in development, they don't want to directly deal with, so they are good with the programming, so they will write the program, inside it they will embed the DML commands also. But sometimes there are users who are directly dealing with the database, that is a user session we saw it. That is what we call as a casual end users, and they are using query language. The programmers will be using DML, which is embedded in a host language. Now if it is a naive or parametric user who don't have any idea about the database but they want something from it, they need a very powerful user friendly interface, right? So that is the relevance of interface. So that interface will hide all the implementation database related details, and through that interface, which is something very user friendly, the user will interact, right, for interacting with the database. These can also be used by casual users or others who do not want to learn the details of the high level data query language. Okay, so like the different levels of things are there. If you want, you can provide interface. So depending on the knowledge level of the user, you can think about any of this variation. Yeah, that about it. Thanks for watching.